Hi, I'm David Hyde. Welcome to the Stone Age.
What I'd like you to do is tell me your name and tell me what you do.
Sure. So I'm David Hyde. I'm the president of a company called 360 Secure. It's a Canadian company but with a global footprint, and we do security, government advisory on legislation, regulation around security, and cannabis is one of the areas that we specialize in.
So why are you a part of the cannabis industry?
I really think that it's something that is offers lots of benefits to people that need treatment that's alternative to the traditional pharmaceutical treatments. Opioids and things are not really that good for you, can be addictive. So I think I like the idea of cannabis, a natural plant that can be used for good. So it's good to work in an industry like that, and there are economic opportunities in that industry as well. So it's nice to marry the two things together, do something that is good for people and also that you can make a living at doing as well.
I want you to explain to me, in your own words, what would you say is the difference between regular cannabis and medical cannabis?
So I think really at its origin, it's the cannabis plant, so it's going to be the same thing. The difference is when it's going to be a medicine, we're talking about patients that have certain ailments that could have compromised immune systems, and so the quality of the plant, any kind of anything that's in the plant that it's got from the soil or from the air needs to be very carefully controlled. So medicinal cannabis tends to be grown in a more controlled environment where you can really make sure that you're screening out any impurities or anything that really ought not to be in there, things like metals and other aspects of the soil that could compromise the quality.
As a security and international regulations expert, what are the prominent risks and problems associated with a spanking new medical cannabis industry?
It's a great question. So I think first of all, we look at things like the risks of the quality of the plant. So it's biosecurity. It's all in and around how we can make sure that the ecosystem for the cultivation of the plant and the processing is done in a secure manner from a biosecurity perspective. So it's controlling who goes into these environments, making sure that people are wearing the appropriate kind of clothing, protective clothing, and that we're providing and maintaining that quality paradigm. When we look at the physicality of the space, these are going to be probably greenhouse facilities or different types of buildings, structures that are going to need to be protected in a certain way. So there are risks of criminal infiltration. There are risks internally by staff that maybe are employed, but they may have an ulterior motive to maybe steal cannabis or to divert cannabis to the black market or divert cannabis for their own personal consumption. This is a risk. Or there's also a risk of outside threats and crimes, such as a robbery or a break-in to the building to steal plants, normally at a more mature stage, or to steal cannabis oil once the plants are extracted and into a smaller format where theft is a lot more amenable to the criminal. So those are some of the threats that we see. And of course, it's just we need to make sure that whoever's working in the industry they're there for a legitimate purpose. So they're looking to do this for the right reason, and we don't have organized criminal elements owning these production sites where there's a potential for there to be mass diversion to the black market. One of the benefits of bringing in a regulated medical cannabis regime is that it can help to subvert the black market to a degree, and it can help to reduce some of the ills that come along with black market cannabis when you have organized crime or criminal elements that can get into things like violence, crime, break-ins, and other things that can come along with the dealing of cannabis at scale.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you put your phone on silent?
I just so heard that. I apologize.
No problem.
There we go.
All right.
All right, so let's go a little bit in terms of personal growing for medical cannabis use.
Yep.
Right? If the average person wants to just grow a couple trees in their backyard,
Yeah.
just so they can make their own medicine for themselves, What would you say are some of the risks, the prominent risks or problems that are associated with that, and what can they do to prevent?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're doing growing on a home basis, I mean, in Canada, for example, you're allowed to grow 4 plants at home, so you can do that. You can grow them inside or outside. The risk, of course, is that there is an obligation that Barbados signed on to, as well as Canada, which is the conventions that were with the UN back to 1961. They're a little bit old, but they are legal frameworks that we all signed on to. And cannabis is restricted in terms of restricting its access to youth, restricting access to people that ought not to be able to contact, mainly youth is the main focus. So I think for the home grower, to me it's a legitimate way of growing your own medicine. I don't think it's the only reason why you shouldn't be able to do that, but I think that there needs to be some thinking that goes along with that from the person growing in terms of how we restrict access into our, if it's a backyard area, if it's being grown inside somewhere, a little bit of thought around the security of that space, the physical security, and any children that are living in the environment need to be kind of kept away from the immediacy of those plants, particularly as they mature.
Now you kind of made me think a little bit about globalization there. So can you tell me what frameworks need to be put in, what framework needs to be put in place in terms of the movement of medical cannabis from one territory to another? From a security perspective.
For sure, yeah. I mean, again, we talk about quality, so biosecurity is the main focus. There's an obligation really in the medical cannabis regime to track the cannabis through the system. So if you grow a certain number of plants, you're going to inventory those plants, and as they come to maturity, they're harvested, then they go through to being dried, eventually maybe to being extracted for oil, or they may be used as a whole flower. There's many different ways, of course, you can consume or use cannabis, but all of those, there needs to be a tracking system in place, and that's part of the conventions, that anything under the convention needs to be tracked from, in a way, seed to sale or beginning to end. So if there's waste cannabis, it needs to be weighed and put to the side so we know where it went, and we're accounting for the cannabis moved through the system. So globally, what we're going to see, in my view, what we're already seeing it, some countries are going to grow more than their domestic supply really necessitates. They're going to be able to export that cannabis for medical purposes only, scientific and medical, not for recreational, but for scientific and medical. You can export, as long as your country allows and the country receiving allows the import, you can do that. But again, we have to hit a certain standard. The cultivation standard is called GACP. It's General Agricultural Collection Practices. And this is a guideline that makes sure that we're growing cannabis in a controlled environment, the quality maintained is quite high, and as we go through the process, we know that it's got a good quality paradigm behind it that's been certified by a professional, someone that is qualified in the area of quality control and growing these plants to a high standard. So that's, I think, the standard we're going to see mainly, GACP. If as a country you grow GACP quality cannabis, my belief is that you'll be able to export that to many, many markets for medical reasons. And in the long run, maybe 10 years or more from now, it's possible we might see a commoditization globally of recreational cannabis. That's not what we're talking about today. I think Barbados' focus is medical cannabis. Yeah. I think it's the right thing to do. I think that there are many people benefiting from cannabis globally. It's working miracles in many cases. So I do applaud Barbados for doing this, but it has to be done in a controlled way, in a way that brings the local people into the market, so there's opportunities for everyone to partake of this opportunity, and it's got to put patients first.
When you were talking about the movement of cannabis, were you speaking of cannabis products alone, or the actual flower or bud itself, or both?
Typically, I'm talking about dried flower. I mean, we can't test it until it gets to a certain stage. Mm-hmm. The cannabis needs to be tested before it's exported. We need to know that we're exporting solidly tested and quality cannabis. So typically, it would go to dried flower, GACP quality, dried flower. We can test that dried flower. It meets the veracity of testing, then we can export it out to another country. But in terms of the scale, I mean, if you're exporting a large amounts of cannabis, 8, 10, 12, 20 pallets of dried flower can take up a lot of room. Mm-hmm. So it can be a lot more appropriate to export the oil. So what you'd do is you'd extract that dried flower into what we'd call first pass oil, and it's still at a fairly crude level, but it would be a much smaller in terms of its payload, and then it would be easier to export that out. That would get tested also to make sure that it's clear of anything that shouldn't be in there, and then it could be exported to a country that would accept it.
As the medical cannabis industry, does that industry have a higher risk involved as opposed to any other industry, particularly dealing with any other herbs? So say, for example, mint or chamomile or anything like that?
It's a really good question because to a certain degree, there's two camps of argument on this point. One camp says it's a plant. And there are other plants that have psychedelic qualities or that could harm you if you were to consume it, or that could have an effect on you, but there's not the same restrictions and security put around that. So on one level you could say, why should cannabis be different? And I think the main reason it's different is because of two reasons. One is there's just a historical kind of a stigma around marijuana, around weed, around ganja, around cannabis, and that's just the reality globally. And right or wrong, that exists, and we're going to see a normalization over time of this. We're already seeing it, I think. But I think the main reason is the conventions that were signed. Like Barbados signed on, Canada signed on, many countries signed on to these the UN conventions that hold you to certain standards. And if you go outside of those standards, then you cannot avail yourself of the other UN kind of protections and benefits that Barbados avails itself of, that Canada and other countries, you can't kind of have your cake and eat it. You can't, have it all. So if you go against the convention, and some people would argue Canada is up against that. Canada has legalized cannabis recreationally, and they've had to do some very, very circuitous legal arguments to try to distinguish what they're doing from the convention. And many people would argue they're in a bit of difficulty to do that. I don't have a strong opinion, I'm not a legal scholar, but I think you could argue this point.
Yeah.
When it comes to medical, there's no question that it's completely allowed under the convention, but you must have a strict paradigm of control and security and quality around it. And this is the reason why I think it is justified to have a higher level of security. But I will say, in Canada, we went way too high. It came out of the gate, and this was protected like it was nuclear material or something really, really crazy. It did not need to be that high, and I think gradually it's come down to a more reasonable level when you look at the security paradigm around cannabis. But many people spent a lot of money that they ought not to have spent because the bar was very high. So I hope that what Barbados does is they look at this in a way, of a very balanced way. What did Canada do? What does Israel do? What are they doing in Colombia? What are they doing in Jamaica? All the countries that have started that movement towards this regulation. And they get the right size and the right mix, because there's a danger of going too far. It'll keep out local providers. It'll keep out entrepreneurial people. Barbados is a entrepreneurial land, as in many of the Eastern Caribbean islands are that way. Why would we hold people back and keep them out? Because the requirements are so high, it's going to cost too much money to get into the marketplace.
Do you think that the security risks in the Caribbean are unique to us? Would we have the same problems the rest of the world is having?
I think that the security risks are unique to every environment, and they're going to be more focused in some environments and much less. Security holds a mirror up to the physical and the cultural and the political environment, the social environments. So, I have not researched the crime rates in Barbados. I have a master's degree in security and crime. I do that kind of research, but I've not looked at Barbados. But if there are crime trends that touch on illegal drug trafficking, which I assume there are some issues there, if there's violence associated, if there's organized criminal elements and all these kind of things, and cannabis would be more attractive possibly, then I think these are things that need to be looked at, and the risks need to be reviewed. And the level of security needs to be commensurate with the level of risk in society around this cannabis plant and its formulations. When it becomes oil, it's this big and it's worth $50,000. When it's a few plants, the value is less. It's still got some value to it. So these are things that need to be considered, and really my view is, what I'd like to suggest, very often we see people focused on the regulation, only the licensing. You have to have a fence maybe around the facility if it's a commercial one. Maybe you need to have some cameras, whatever the standard is. But I always advise, of course you have to meet those to get a license, but I recommend people do their own risk assessment as a business owner, because sometimes the legal requirements doesn't take care of your staff, doesn't take care of the information, let's say the protection of your computer that has all the patient information, that may not be covered inside the regulation. But as a responsible business owner, as a cannabis company owner, you need to think about these risks more broadly than just the regulations. So do a risk assessment, look at the local crime rates, look at the local security and safety risk factors, and build a program that ties in with those.
Do you think our Caribbean law enforcement needs to be trained in a particular way in order to deal with the potential risks associated to the medical cannabis industry? I
think with law enforcement, it tends to be, first of all, the issues of, if anything changes in the laws of consumption, they're going to need education. If trafficking such laws are adjusted or changed, there's a lot now where legal patients have a right to carry cannabis and use cannabis. So law enforcement needs to be trained in the regulatory shape so they understand how that they may now deal with cannabis differently, and they need to adjust themselves in that way. When it comes to the security risks more broadly, there is an illicit market here for cannabis, and there is crime that centers around that, and I think the police have to deal with that now. This would be a fairly similar situation. The security ought to be higher under the regulations. The risks ought to be a little lower, but there's still potential for there to be crime in and around these locations, and the police need to be aware of that.
So do you think the sale of, I would say, other illicit drugs would increase? Do you think the sale of cannabis in the black market is going to increase now that there's a medical cannabis industry blooming?
It's a really good question, and it really depends on how the government handles the file. At the end of the day, if the government taxes it heavily and makes production very expensive, then the price of medical cannabis is going to be double or triple black market. So I don't know the cost structures here. I haven't done that research again. So it could be that the black market cost is a bit higher comparatively than other countries. I'm not too sure. But I think there's a relationship, a correlation between the price of cannabis on the black market here on the island here, and the price that you'll be able to avail yourself of medical cannabis with a prescription or with permission from a medical practitioner. And if that price is a big distance between those two prices, then medical patients are going to go and access the black market because they're not going to be able to afford the legal prescription. So I think the government has an obligation to try to do its best to minimize the regulatory burden, to minimize the taxation structure around cannabis, to make it affordable for medical patients. And if they do that, I do believe that you might see a mild suppression of the black market. There's still, though, for the recreational user that can't avail of the medical market, they're still going to go to the black market in a similar vein. And over time, some countries go from medical to recreational once it gets comfortable and situated. Other countries will never go to an adult use market. It's really, each country is unique.
Do you think medical cannabis is going to kind of be like a medical gateway drug, so to speak? Because I know that in other parts of the world, they're saying, well, if you're going to make cannabis legal for medicinal purposes, then what about mushrooms, and what about LSD and those type of things? So what are your takes on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on which drug we're talking about. Many drugs have different effects and different potential to become something that you would rely on, like the addiction level of each drug. I mean, I've not heard of any research that would suggest that cannabis, medical cannabis, would be some kind of a gateway drug that would bring you into other drug use.
No, from the point of view of after people have realized that cannabis can be used for medicinal purposes.
Sure.
And do you think, and legal framework going towards that? Do you think, for example, mushrooms going to start leading towards that route because, in a sense, the medical cannabis is a gateway? Yeah. So it opens up the drug use for medicinal purposes then?
And I think it will. I think it has the potential to, for sure. And when you look at the mushroom example, there are some very, very helpful medical qualities in that particular product. So I think that it will be something that's looked upon as maybe a movement to a degree towards regulating medicinal plants and herbs that have the psychedelic capacity to it. And I think that we will see more. We're already seeing in one U.S. state, I believe, they're talking about mushrooms, being regulated. They're doing some studies now on that, and I do think we're going to see that become more widespread. But again, I do believe that it will need to be very tightly controlled. There is globally a paradigm around pharmaceutical drugs. There's also a paradigm around nutraceutical, around natural health products as well. So I think you'll see these frameworks wrapped around these different herbs and medicines that will make sure that they can't get into the wrong hands and they're dispensed appropriately in appropriate dosages, so there's not really an uptick in negative effects. And I think this is a bit of a watershed moment. This medical cannabis legalization and regulation will open the door. It's going to help to normalize cannabis use as just something that's good in life if you use it for good. And also I think it'll open up a gateway for other forms of herbs that have medicinal qualities to them.
There was a while ago, I think it was when Canada sort of redid their framework. You tweeted that it was a pretty good thing that they were doing. They included risk-based licensing.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is and why that is such a good element to have included?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of areas where I think risk comes into play. One of them is in Canada. There's 185 license holders now, and they're all operating at different levels of sophistication, different size and scale, etc., doing different things and products and activities. What the regulator found was they were spending a lot of time at each one doing monthly inspections and that. So now what it is, it's a risk-based inspection regime where if you prove that you're a responsible license holder and you actually, when they come and inspect you, you're compliant and they don't find what they call observations, which would be a negative finding, and there aren't serious breaches of the regulations, then they'll come every 2 months, every 3 months, every 6 months. So gradually, it's a risk-based kind of licensing model. That's one direction where Canada is applying a risk-based model. The other one would be in the area of security. When the regulations first came out in 2013, they prescribed a very high level of security, and the security gathered around physicality, so fences, locks, gates, walls, bars on windows, and technology, cameras, access control, burglar alarm systems. This was the two thrusts of Canada's regulation. And right from the beginning, I always said security has 4 cornerstones to it. Physical security is 1, technological security is 2, personnel security and procedural security. And these 2 were missed off the list. So what Canada's done now in coming around the latest iteration of the cannabis regulation, which came out in October of 2018, they have what's called an organizational security plan that every license holder must put in place. And they must have a head of security that's qualified to administer that program and understands the regulations. So now we have a situation where you have someone who understands security. They have to build a program, and the program must have mandatory elements in it of all of the 4 cornerstones. So I really like that approach, and I was very supportive of the government for doing that, because it allows some flexibility for the license holder. It's not one size fits all. If you have a big greenhouse or a small building for extraction of cannabis oil, these are very different facilities with different needs, different numbers of staff, and different risks. So the security is not one size fits all. It needs to be flexible, and I like Canada's more recent approach, which replaced the initial approach, which was much too focused on 1 or 2 aspects and not a broader risk-based approach.
Okay. You've been to Jamaica. I'm sure you would have had conversations with not just Barbadians, but other Caribbean people with regards to medical cannabis, security issues, and so on. Where do you think we are at right now? And what do you think we need to do in order to get ourselves to a standard that would be on par of where we want to go?
Well, there's a few tricky navigational items to work around. One of them is the banking, right? In terms of any banking related to cannabis can be problematic. So I think that the government's going to have to figure out that piece. When you go to Jamaica, there's a lot of money I recognize that it's not all medical cannabis, etc. But when you go to Jamaica, there's a lot of cannabis being stored in different places, and a lot of money being stored because you can't bank the money. It's very difficult. So this is the same as the United States, and there's a high degree of risk around large volumes of cash tied to cannabis. So I think banking is one of the significant challenges, and the security risk can gather around the cash and around the storage of cannabis, how it's stored. So I think that's going to be important to get that right. I think, again, having a really tight paradigm around who's allowed to enter the industry. We want to bring in the legacy growers that are growing now on the island here. They're experienced, they know what they're doing, and I think most of them are providing this herb to people, or many of them, where it's doing benefit to them. It's helping them with aches and pains, with anxiety, with a wide range of things. But if we have organized criminals that are growing cannabis and selling it here, and the proceeds are being used for illegitimate reasons, these people ought not to be allowed to be within the regulated marketplace. So I would hope to see regulations here that would allow the legacy existing growers to impart their wisdom and knowledge, but there would be a barrier for owning the whole company, or for having the money and the operating mind behind these businesses. There needs to be a little bit of attention put to make sure that we don't get hardened, proven, organized criminals into those roles. And then I think we need to have a realistic security paradigm put around the medical cannabis regime. What I'm hearing from the conference I've been attending yesterday and today so far, I think the government's taking it quite seriously. I think that they understand a lot of what's happening out there. I don't think they're going to follow blindly, whether it be Canada, whether it be any other country. But I think they're gathering information and creating what I hope will be a responsible framework to regulate medical cannabis here in Barbados.
One last question. You mentioned banking. Is there a possibility that if banking is not included in this whole medical cannabis reformation or revolution that we're going through right now, is there a possibility that that is going to actually impact crime on the island or in the Caribbean negatively?
I think it can, yes, because the reality is, you know, when you as a owner of a cannabis company, if you're getting paid for the product that you sell through into be, let's say, dispensed through pharmacies or however it gets to the patients, there's cash that's exchanging hands. Money's being paid, right? And again, depending on whether there's insurance to pay for some of this, that will affect the extent and volume of cash. But when you are selling cannabis, there's going to be an amount of cash that's going to gather at areas where cannabis is sold. And that money is difficult to put into a traditional banking system. So if the potential criminals can find out where this money might be, or they know that there's certain pharmacies, dispensaries, or certain areas around, or the owner of the cannabis company that can't bank the money they make because they're restricted from doing so, these are all things that can drive crime rates. They can drive criminal intent. And you know, we've seen in the United States, for example, there's been deaths in dispensaries. Security people have been killed. We've seen robberies and break-and-enters and crime coalesce around some of these areas when we don't have an effective banking program. So I do think that it's important, and I do